Hello, everyone. Welcome to Yemidi Media Show. Today we have a special guest, author of the book, The Tigrayan Electrician, The Memories of My Father and His Beloved Motherland. This book came out March this year, and it's about a very fascinating story and, of course, a tragedy that happened 47 years to the month in March 1976. I'm joined by author Dr. Issayas Yrgaw Bahta. Dr. Issayas, welcome to MD.
Thank you. Thank you. I am honored to be here, Getachew, and I really appreciate your invitation for this session to create more exposure to my book.
Great. It's my pleasure to have you. Of course, we had a session almost 2 years ago on your journey, very interesting journey, and part of that journey is captured in this important book, I must say. So, for those who are just joining us online, and for those who would also watch this on satellite under HBS in the Horn of Africa, I would invite you to have a copy of this book. For those who are following us online, I have just pinned the link to the Amazon link of the book, so you can find that there, and it's a must-have book, I must say. It tells about the places, the thoughts, the community, everything, the politics, of course, of that time, and of course, it was written in a time where the same community, is going in a large scale tragedy under the Tigray war. Dr. Issayas, first, this all starts with your father, Mr. Yrgaw Bahta, who hails from First Mai, Hahaila, near Adwa. And that night, March 28th, 1976, was on a Sunday. You are 15.
That is correct.
Yeah, maybe let's your memories of Asmara at that time. I don't think you have been to Adwa or to where your father is from at that time, but can you paint what Asmara looked like, what the society, the community looked like? Your grade maybe 9, or is that?
Yes, grade
Okay.
9. That is
Okay.
correct. Yeah.
Can you take us back 47 years back to Asmara of that time?
Absolutely, absolutely. As you mentioned, when the tragic events of March 28, 1976 happened, I was 15 years old, and up to that time, I had a wonderful childhood. My memory of Asmara, life there was just fantastic. Any childhood anybody could really wish for. First of all, filled with love of a loving mother, a loving father, siblings, friends, schoolmates, and the citizens of Asmara as a whole. Everything obviously was turned upside down on that night when my father was killed by Ethiopian government soldiers. Life up to then, as I said, couldn't have been better. Of course, when we look back at our childhood, we're bound to remember the good things we had. But truly, I believe those were wonderful times. There was relative peace. There was a lot of friendship and love between all sorts of inhabitants of Asmara at that time. And it is within that context that obviously everything was shattered, not only for me and for my family, but also for a great deal of the inhabitants of Asmara from then on.
One thing that, given the timing of your writing and so on, and this happened at least close to 5 decades ago, what was in your mind when you decided to write this book, in terms of even the timing and the push?
True, true. As you can imagine, losing my father in such a violent manner at an early age uh, becomes really a turning point, a very important part of my life. Therefore, I have carried that night with me for the rest of my life. That moment has become a central part of my life. So, in a way, telling this story, bringing this out, has been a project in the making since then, clearly. So, I have really wanted to write this book, not only because it was important for me to be able to go through those events and understand what happened, but also to make sure that uh, my close family members, my children, my nephews, my nieces, also understand what happened, but also be able to tell them what kind of person my father was. Uh, there is always a time in our life where certain things that we have meant to do for a long time actually are pushed into reality by events. And obviously, those events are the events that occurred in Tigray in the last 3 years. As everybody from your listeners know, from many of the broadcasts that you have been undertaking yourself, uh, on November 4, 2020, there has been a terrible war that was unleashed on Tigray in northern Ethiopia after a total enclosure and separation and isolation of Tigray from the rest of the world. This has obviously initiated and reignited all the traumas I have been through when my father was killed. As you said in your introduction, my father's birthplace is near Adwa in Farasmai and Haile. Uh, and it was his birthplace that was undertaking this terrible war at that time. There is an eerie similarity in my mind to what has happened in Tigray at a very, very large scale and to what happened to my family on March 28, 1976, when my father was killed. My father was killed by Ethiopian soldiers inside our house in the early evening of that day. The whole night after his death, my family and I were left to tend to his body in complete and total isolation. We were in a city that was a relatively large city with plenty of neighbors, with a government in place, with the police, hospitals, fire people, everyone that is supposed to provide help in times of danger and in times of distress. But we got no help at all. So we were utterly isolated from the rest of the universe with my father dying in our apartment. This sense of isolation has left a really significant mark in my life. And when I saw Tigray being isolated completely by the Ethiopian government and its allies, totally cut off from the rest of the world, a region that has 6 to 7 million people, children, women, elderly, sick people, and crushed with this terrible war, attacked from all directions, that really initiated the trauma I went through and was really a major push for me to write this book and tell my story. And in the process, obviously, try to tell the world the terrible tragedy that was occurring in Tigray as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the what I saw in the book is how, as they say, history repeats itself. there are equivalent characters both from victim side in terms of uh, your father, Mr. Yrgaw, Bahta, and others at that night who were killed for a reason of they never participated, or it was has nothing to do with what happened there. But at that night, what triggered this for the Ethiopian military to um, kill a number of civilians, including your father, was the murder of Colonel Bishu, who was, I think, one of the senior commanders in Asmara. What did you know at that time about this, and maybe later, because this is something that you are writing way longer after it happened, and maybe learning a lot from other sources as well, including books written about that incident and so on.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, as you can imagine, at that time, we had no idea of what is happening except really suffering the consequences of what has happened. So, late in the evening on March 28, 1976, it was a Sunday, around 5 to 6 p.m., there were very loud gunshot wounds near our house. They were very loud. It was clear that they were coming from very nearby. At that time, I remember we were in our house. My father hasn't arrived yet. There was a curfew at that time, and we were worried my father would not make it beyond the curfew, but he did. He did come home. Uh, the gunshots, obviously, after that initial firing, stopped, but then within a couple of hours, by about 8, probably 9 p.m., we started hearing more and more gunshots, but this time, very frighteningly, they were accompanied by shouts of civilians that obviously were victims of those gunshot wounds. It was clear at that time to us that there was a lot of activity from the military within the civilian houses near us. We were obviously terrified that Ethiopian soldiers wouldn't breach and come in our house, because we knew that they had done similar things against civilians in the past. And we knew that once your house is breached and the military entered your house, obviously the worst could happen. And it did. It did. We heard extremely loud bangs of the door being breached uh, with heavy, heavy uh, guns, and obviously there were stairs to get to our place, and we could hear the thumping of the boots of the soldiers rushing towards our place. Our door, which was a very simple door, was breached without any problem, and suddenly our little house of few rooms, large, was filled with fully armed soldiers, ready for battle, with their guns pointed at whoever was in front of them, with their eyes really extremely, extremely angry. Clearly, they were not soldiers to protect civilians, they were soldiers ready for a battle. They invaded our house immediately, and in one of the other rooms where my father was holding my younger brother, they shot him. They shot him, and he fell holding my brother. And my uncle was with us that night. They took my uncle downstairs with them, and so it was, 7 children, my mother, her mother. We were left there to tend to my father. As you can imagine, it was the longest night of my life. I remember vividly trying to get minutes to pass, hours to pass, and for the sun to come up, and that was not happening. And as I said before, there was no help at all. Later on, as you mentioned, we found out that the initial gunfire was actually due to a killing of a major Ethiopian military officer by Eritrean freedom fighters near our house. And the soldiers coming to the houses, to our house, and the ones surrounding there, was essentially a revenge, a reprisal by the Ethiopian army. One of the things I mentioned earlier on was the fact that there were parallels, to that night, to what happened in Tigray later. And the parallel is this, Getachew. Soldiers in a country, government in a country, their number one role is to protect civilians, citizens, right? So you put your security at the hands of those who are in charge, right? Those who are in charge, who are supposed to secure our safety, breached our house and killed my father, who had nothing to do with what happened that night to the Ethiopian military officer. Similarly, the Ethiopian government, when it started its war against Tigray, had excuses about how he had disagreements with the regional government of Tigray, how he went into war with the regional government of Tigray. And yet, the war was against the very people it was supposed to protect. There was no other government on November 4, 2020 to protect the Tigray people except the government in Addis Ababa. And yet, not only did that government relinquish that responsibility, but it became the very aggressor, the very entity that put in practice the aggression and the decimation of the Tigray people. So the government killed my father 47 years ago, a father that should have been protected by that government, and the same thing happened in Tigray. These are parallels that really reignited the trauma in my mind throughout the process.
Yeah, very important. Yeah. Yeah, one of our followers under the name Tigray Update is asking from Australia if there is any international shipping option. I want to buy this, so that should be possible. Actually, I was trying to look. Maybe there could be a dedicated Australian Amazon website, but there are a number of other outlets also selling the book. So let me know if you can't find that, and we will make that possible. Um, so on the family of seven, you were 15, but you had a brother as young as few months old when this
Yes,
happened. And we also see how your mother, Mama Goy, is a strong woman, and a person who had to take care of everything after that. So, if you were to paint a picture when your father died, he was 45, only 45.
yes,
So how life changed after that? After that evening of Sunday, March 28th, 1976.
absolutely. So my father was the breadwinner in our household. Like many families back home, the father is the main breadwinner, and there are no uh, really any processes by which the family could really go on. If something happens, the breadwinner, there is no such thing as life insurance. There is nothing as pension, as you may know. Um, so our life, the way we knew it, was totally changed at that time, and all the responsibility to really carry on raising us was, fell on my mother's shoulder. My mother obviously was totally distraught when this happened. I do remember that after my father was shot, one of the clear memories I have is my mother running back to see him after she heard that loud bang that killed my father, but then returning to the room where we were, the children, and telling us how, your father is dead, your father is dead. And as she was doing that, she was actually plucking her hair off, which is a sign of grief back home, as you know. Um, as you know, in our culture, whenever somebody passes away and the news have to be broken to somebody, very often when the news is told to the women, the first thing they do is hold the women's hands, because one of the really reactions of grief is to pluck their hair. That's what women do when somebody really close to them passes away. But there was nobody to hold my mother's hand, so I could see her really plucking her hair with tremendous suffering visible in her face. That carried through, obviously, in the early days after my father passed, but reality sank afterwards. She had to take care of us. She had to find ways to keep us together, and this was really the most important preoccupation for her, not only from an economic and practical financial point of view, but because the aggression of the Ethiopian government against civilians was ongoing at that time. After my father died, one thing that was happening in Asmara was soldiers, especially secret government entities that we called Afany, used to drive white Volkswagen Kombi around town. And if they saw youngsters, they would just kidnap them. And after a few days, the bodies of those youngsters would be found in various parts of Asmara, particularly an area called Solot in the southeast portion of Asmara. So my mother was terrified that not only, obviously, she couldn't tend for us financially, but she could lose us as well, particularly me, because I was the oldest son. But she did manage. She was a woman that never went to school, and she was always, obviously, under the protection of my father. But strength and resilience just came back after my father died, and she obviously did everything she could to get through this. And one of the things she did was to get me out of the country. And because there was no official way for me to leave the country, she actually let me go through the border of the Sudan to become a refugee there, which now, as a parent, I find that extremely a difficult decision, but that was a decision she took. And that's the kind of strong woman she became. And it's no surprise that she was able to keep us all together, even after such a tragic events.
Mm. Yeah, that's also what is highlighted in the book. For our viewers, if you go to Amazon, there is a lot of uh, appreciation and very positive and uh, very reviews that would make you read, make you want to have your own copy. So I'm one of the people who had an opportunity to read it in advance as well. So I encourage everyone to have a copy. Reflect on that. One of the reviewers was one of the G13, the Dr. Araya Debesai, where he talks about what I found fascinating about the book is that it gives the reader a vivid account of the tormenting years of the civilian population had to endure during the liberation war, when Eritrean young men and women resorted to an armed struggle to reclaim the independence of their country. And many other readers from Canada, the UK, different countries have put uh, their reviews there, and all are, I would say, the verified purchase, and you can read for yourself and have your own copy. Dr. Issayas, one of the things that you also highlighted is on your journey out of Asmara and all that, and you successfully, I must say, have woven into your journey and that night and the past, the present at that time, and so on. So, what was the process of writing all these? Given that you are writing it later and you had to rely on memories, maybe some research as well, and so on. So, what was it like?
Absolutely. So it is, as you can imagine, a very difficult book to write. And I must say, it's not an easy read either, just because of the topic that is there. As you correctly said, I do talk about my life after my father's death as well, and the journeys that I took myself to escape the grasp of the Ethiopian government's terrorizing war at that time. Uh, but that was inevitable. The story of my father abruptly, ended as I was a teenager. So his story, his death, is invariably my story as well, because that is what really determined the trajectory of what happened to me afterward as well. So I could not write about what has happened to my father without writing what happened to me afterwards as well. Uh, One of the things that I miss dearly, Getachew, is the fact that I have not had the opportunity to have a conversation with my father as an adult. I always envy, other people when I see them talking to their elderly parents as adults. I've known my father as a child, or barely kind of coming to age at the age of 15, but that was it. So in my book, I wanted to really have that conversation with him, be able to tell him what happened after he passed away. And many of the chapters are structured in such a way, me having a conversation with my father. But that conversation really had to happen uh, at the moments I have the most vivid memory of him, and that is the night he passed. So I imagined him dying and really looking back at his life, but also having an opportunity to glimpse at what may have happened in the future. And I used that imagination really to strike a conversation with my father, to be able to do what I have not been able to do in reality, which is know my father as an adult person.
That's a very interesting approach where you have this combination of you start with some text in italics and then you go to a different form that is so beautiful and where you try against all odds or against the darkness and the long night of that night, you try to bring some love, some positivity in terms of life and so on. So that's also what you learned from uh, your mom and your dad during that time. One thing that our viewers, we didn't introduce you that way is you are a successful professional. You are a surgeon, weight loss surgeon,
Yes.
and you are a family man, and you have been very active during the past 2 years, 3 years on advocating for Tigray, and you are dedicating this book as well to the survivors. And not only that, the proceeds, all proceeds from this book is to support survivors as well. So that connection, when 47 years ago you had to witness a big tragedy at a young age, and then as a professional who is dedicated to his profession, to his family, you had to relive that night to write this one while also witnessing and advocating for survivors of Tigray genocide. How does that play out for you?
So yeah, absolutely. So as I said, the trauma of that night is something that I had to deal with as an adult. I have to obviously say that earlier on in my life, even starting from that night and the years afterwards, for many years, this was an event I wanted to completely shut off from my mind. So I really, I say to people, for instance, that if they had asked me about what had happened to me, 10 years ago, I would not have been able to articulate this at all. So, in a way, writing the book for me was a way of dealing with what happened, at that time. But as you said, rather than recrimination and feelings of hate, I wanted really to provide a tone of atonement, so to speak, as I look at the events. That is in partly from what I've learned from my father, but also from my mother, on the fact that yes, there are tragedies, yes, there are challenges in life, but at the end of the day, we have to hang on to positive things. We have to hang on to an optimistic outlook ahead of us for us to be able to appreciate life in all, in all its facets. One thing I mention in the book, for instance, is that when I was leaving Asmara to escape through the border in the Sudan, there was a lot of commotion in our house, particularly my grandmother, my father's mother. We didn't tell her I was leaving, but just looking at me, she knew I was leaving for good. And she was really distraught, and she was crying. And my mother, started crying with her as well, because immediately a lot of anxiety came to her as well, because she was sending her son, 15-year-old by himself. Um, and immediately all the concerns came up. But one thing she told my grandmother was, yes, he's going away, but Mariam, which is Saint Mary in our religion, Mariam will protect him. She said, I know there is goodness out there, and my son will find that goodness. That's something that always stayed with me, essentially knowing that, yes, there are difficulties, but at the end, there is goodness in the world as well. And, by that time, my mother had never been abroad. She didn't know anything at all about any other place apart from the areas where she lived. And yet, intuitively, she knew there were good things outside, right? And I did find that. You mentioned that I had become a successful professional, becoming a surgeon, doing something I love doing. And the reason is because I really carried that with me also, and I did. And there are some people actually that I dedicate the book to also that have been really critical to me. That people I found through my journey that really express the goodness that is in the world. So yes, there is evil. There is evil, like the government of Ethiopia, its policies, its soldiers, what they've done to us. But there is also goodness in the world, and it was important for me to express that and tell everybody that read the book that it's not just about the tragedy that occurred, but the goodness that I have found in my journeys in the world as well.
Hmm. That's very interesting. So, given that you this was published, I was actually looking at the publication date. It was March 31st, almost 47 to the day of that tragedy. Uh, so far, how has been, the feedback and the reflection you are getting? I'm sure many people uh, who witnessed that night or that evening, or even the who had to go through the same kind of tragedy, must be, finding this well documented, and the way you wrote it and so on. So what did it look like in terms of after you wrote it and it's out of your hand?
Great, absolutely great. As you said, for people who have lived historically in that time, and many who also lost loved ones at the hands of the Ethiopian soldiers at that time, it is something that they have not had a chance to deal with for many reasons. And reading my book was a way for them to revisit that and also really share in the grief that I went through as well. One of the interesting things about that night, Getachew, uh, is as I was doing research to really try to understand what happened, um, what the events were, I went through the archives of news outlets of Asmara on March 28, 1976, right? 70 plus civilians were massacred that night in the middle of Asmara, a city that is a major capital in East Africa. It has diplomats, it had journalists, right? And yet there was no mention about that massacre in any of the major newspapers. The only mention I could find, believe it or not, was in Kabul Daily, an Afghanistan newspaper. Kabul Daily had a small column saying civilians have been killed in Asmara on this night to revenge the killing of an Ethiopian soldier. So to me, that was tragic. Not only there was this tragedy of death of so many people, so many civilians, like my own father, right? But the world went by without even mentioning that, right? And this really adds to the angst and to the and to the suffering in a way. So when I wrote this book and really focused on that night, many people who felt the same way because of this sense of forgetfulness of the world really appreciated that. So the feedback from that point of view has been very, very good. One thing that I do mention in the book, and one thing that really is mentioned by many people who came back to me after reading the book, is what has happened the day after the killing of my father. So not only the soldiers went from house to house to kill many people who lived in the area surrounding where the Ethiopian soldier had been assassinated or elected military, but what the soldiers did was they went around other areas of Asmara. They killed many other people. They brought their bodies and they lay their bodies around that block. So when people woke up in the morning, there were bodies all over that area that had been brought from their houses, killed, and left there as well. That is such a traumatic thing, not only for the people whose loved ones have died, but for the people who were waking up that morning to go out. And many people actually talked to me about that. It is something I did mention in the book as well.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think in Tigray and in Eritrea at that time, it was not uncommon to see, kill people put on the main squares, main streets. I don't know if they were trying to terrorize, the general public and so on. One of your readers, this is Chiatara Rita Laker. I hope I'm doing their name right. As a psychologist, I can only imagine the incredibly emotional process it was for the author to share this story of his life, his father, and his war-torn country. I appreciate the honesty, openness in his writing, and the nuance it brought to my understanding of Tigrayan history. I think this speaks to the process itself, the content, and the format, and the kind of emotional connection you had to the story and so on. So I again, before we finish today, I invite our viewers to have a copy of this. The link to the Amazon page of the book is pinned on the comment section. You can find it there, and get your copy, get it shared with people, discuss. And we want many people to be aware of what has happened before, and what's happening today as we speak in Tigray and in that region at large. So before we finish our English session, our viewers will have also a Tigrinya session after some break and a different link. Uh, Dr. Issayas, what's next? What do you see happening in terms of telling the story out and sharing it, and so on? What do you see um, in terms of the young generation, the generations that had to go through that, and so on? What would be your message as a person who experienced that at a young age, and who is witnessing what's happening now, and who have had now an opportunity to write about it, to talk about that? What would be your message?
I mean, my message would be that, first of all, it is important for us to be able to tell our stories, whether it's in writing as a book, whether it's in broadcasts, whether it's through social media, so that we liberate ourselves also from the trauma that we have been, because of the fact that the political leaders, the people responsible for really leading us, particularly the Ethiopian governments, have been so cruel against civilians throughout our living memory. I do want them to understand that, and I do want the younger generation also to know about these personal tragedies, the things that have happened to us. I was talking recently, actually, with Heriti Mehret Ab. She is a former fighter of the TPLF, whom I had the fortune of knowing in the Sudan when I was young. And she and her family also went through a similar tragedy. Her father, in the mid 1970s, was put in prison in Mekelle in Tigray, and then her father, along other civilians, was brutally murdered over a bridge in Mekelle, and their bodies were burned at that time. Right? This is somebody who had children. Heriti has siblings like myself. Her mother was left by herself to tend for her family. But these are personal stories that don't come out, and they need to come out, because unless we talk about our personal tragedies, just talking in general about the cruelty of the Ethiopian government may not really show clearly the actual impact in our society. So I encourage people to tell their stories, and I hope that my book will be an impetus for more people to do so.
Great. This is a journey that covers a lot of geography as well, from Hahaila, First Mai, near Adwa, to Asmara, to Sudan, to Europe. Everywhere you go, you will learn a thing or two in terms of at that time what has been going on, and also at the young person at that time at the age of 15, what Dr. Issayas Yrgaw Bahta and his younger siblings, his mom, his grandmom, his uncle had to go through. And I'm not going to uh, talk about more than this. You have to have your own copy and read it for yourself, and discuss with friends and family. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Issayas Yrgaw, and I will continue on another channel in Tigrinya.
Thank you for having me, Getachew. I very much appreciate it.
Great. You have been following us live with Dr. Issayas Yrgaw Bahta, who published in March The Tigrayan Electrician. Is a book about his father under the subtitle The Memories of My Father and His Beloved Motherland. You can find the book, you can get your copy from Amazon, and the link of that is pinned on the comment section of this channel. And for those who are following us on satellite under HBS, you can also contact us on ways to find the book. We'll try to give you information if you cannot access it online. That is the end of the show for today in terms of the English one, and we'll continue in Tigrinya soon.